Attention everybody, the views and opinions expressed on this show are not necessarily those of Axe Ministry, Axe Media Group, and or their affiliate supported ministries and or nonprofits. So now here he is. I don't know what episode number this is, but he's going to be talking about some really cool stuff today. Your host of Crime Time, Dr. Steve Albrecht. Take it away.
Thanks, producer Matt. This is Crime Time podcast number 53. So we'll be talking about crime and crooks today. We'll be talking about an app that's called Cop in Your Pocket. I'm developing this app with my colleague from San Diego PD, Robert Smith, and he is the CEO and founder of NightClubSecurity.com. He teaches nightclub security, bar bouncers, and staff security for bars and restaurants and nightclubs and things like that. So we're working on an app called Cop in Your Pocket, and we'll talk about what that means and what it might be in terms of the design as we go forward today. So welcome to Crime Time podcast episode 53. I'm Steve Albrecht, joining you from the Axe Media Group studios in Springfield, Missouri. For this hour, we'll be talking about this app and doing a little Crime Time Stupid Crook of the Week, and also the Crime Time Safety Tip of the Week, and also a little Crime Time IQ test. So back to the normal show design that I usually do, and next week I'll have a great guest, and today it's just me. So thanks for listening to Crime Time, where we talk about crime and crooks and cops and personal security. We talk about dangerous people and lots of heroes. We'll even mention a few stupid crooks, and most importantly, I'll tell you, and we can talk about what you can do to keep yourself and your family safe from crime and violence. As always, you need to be vigilant at home and in your neighborhood and in your community and at school and on the road and at work. This show exists to make you feel more empowered, more secure, and more educated on security issues and the criminal justice system. So as background, I work for the San Diego Police Department for 15 years as a patrol officer, reserve sergeant, and a domestic violence investigator. I now work as a training consultant. I teach training workshops online and live, focusing on human resources, employee coaching, workplace violence, which is my primary subject, and security issues in the workplace. I've written 23 books on business, workplace violence, police subjects, and guns, all of which you can find on Amazon. My 3 gun books are on Amazon Kindle: Albrecht on Guns, Volume 1, Albrecht and Farrow on Guns, Volume 2, and Albrecht on Guns, Volume 3. Working on Albrecht on Guns, Volume 4 right now, and that one should be done right around Christmas time. You can always reach me at my website at crimetimeradio.com. You can send me an email, contact, and connect with me on LinkedIn at Dr. Steve Albrecht. That's Albrecht. And you can always follow me on Twitter at Dr. Steve Albrecht as well. You can find past episodes of the show on SoundCloud.com, and new ones post every day after we finish on YouTube, of course. So this new app is called Cop in Your Pocket. And when you think about apps, there are about 3 million. Think about that, 3 million apps in the world for iPhone and Android. I think Android's got the lead. I think it's about 2.4 million Android apps, and there's about 1 point something iPhone apps. So why do you need another one? Well, what we're trying to do with this design of Cop in Your Pocket is look at the information people typically need about safety and security and calling 911 and what crimes mean. And it'll be kind of like a Rolodex, if you remember what a Rolodex is. Some of you are under 35 are going to have to Google that. But it's a Rolodex is a collection of information that people can sort of scan through and skim through. It'll be a collection of tabs that people will be able to get information really quickly about certain things that connect to working with the police or contacting the police about certain issues that they're concerned about. So the premise is it is a collection of information about the criminal justice system. Knowledge is power for you. Information is power. So let's talk about some of the topics that we're going to cover on the app itself. So think about you're in a situation where there's a loud party, and you're in an apartment or you're in a condo or you're at home, and there's a loud party in your street on Friday night, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, which is actually Saturday morning, and you're bugged about it, can't get any sleep, and the neighbors are having a wicked tear-down party. You call 911 for that situation, or do you call the non-emergency number for the PD? Well, it depends. I mean, if there's fighting and violence and people are, whizzing in the street and breaking bottles, you probably call 911. But there's also the non-emergency number for the PD, which you could call as well. And so this app will have kind of a description of things that you need to get to in terms of keeping yourself and your family safe. So there's a car blocking your street, and it's been sitting there, and it's been stripped, and it's obviously abandoned, and it's been longer than 72 hours. Do you call the emergency number for 911 for that? You don't. So there's a non-emergency number for your PD, for your sheriff's department to say, hey, come and get this car. So the app will be covering things like, is this a civil issue, a boundary dispute between me and my neighbor, or is it a criminal issue? Is there some kind of criminal thing between my neighbor and me, or is it a civil problem? The police don't typically handle civil issues, they handle criminal things. So there'll be a lot of descriptions of stuff that could be, a coin flip as to whether or not you need to call the emergency number or the non-emergency number. The other thing we're going to do is put in a number of definitions for things that the police do all the time. For example, there is a concept with the cops called making a hot stop. A hot stop is a high-risk vehicle stop where they extract people from the car, and it's typically done at gunpoint and at shotgun point or rifle point. These folks have robbed a bank or shot somebody or been a drive-by, or they're murder suspects, and there's a whole procedure for how the cops extract people from cars, one or more suspects inside a car, and we call it a hot stop. So we'll have a definition of what a hot stop is. So there'll be a lot of things about how you get stuff handled in your community. Let's say you've got a bullying type of a neighbor. Is that a police issue? Maybe. I mean, if the guy's involved in criminal behavior, but typically there's something called, neighborhood mediation, and lots of communities have a social services sort of an arm in them that's typically a grant-funded program or a city or county program that helps neighbors work out disputes. So you may be able to get a restraining order against that neighbor if your neighbors all agree, stuff like that. Let's say you have an animal control issue. So what do the police respond to when it comes to animals? Do they come out for dangerous animals that bite people, or is that an animal control thing, or do you have to handle it yourself? Somebody's blocking your actual driveway, you can't leave your house. I mean, that's typically going to be a more high priority call than just a car that's been parked there for a couple days. How do you get a restraining order? What's the process for getting a restraining order against somebody if you're in a DV relationship, or it's just a neighborhood thing, or even a workplace thing? That might be a topic of conversation in the app as well as to how to get a restraining order. We'll talk about what you do in crossing the border. And so going down to Mexico, you have certain issues about safety, and that your rights change dramatically when you cross into another country as opposed to what you can do here in the United States. And then crossing into Canada, what are your rights? And so that'll be a topic on the app as well, crossing into other countries, going into other countries, and also what the police response is in other countries besides the United States is dramatically different than here. We'll talk about ATM safety, being safe at an ATM. What are some of the rules and guidelines there? Like, not going at nighttime, obviously, and going through in your car if you can, as opposed to walking up. And if you have to walk up, can you do it in daylight where people can see you, or when the bank is open itself, or you can have somebody with you who watches your back while you get your money out of the ATM. We'll talk about street safety, looking at what's going on in certain situations in the street so that you pay attention as you're going to the bank or the liquor store or the grocery store, what's happening in the parking lots, etc. We'll talk about carjacking. And that's an interesting sort of dynamic. Is carjacking a robbery, or is it an auto theft? And it's kind of both, right? It's you're being robbed of your car, and it's also an auto theft. So it can be categorized in kind of two ways. Now, from you as the person on the receiving end of the carjacking, you don't care whether it's a robbery or carjacking. You're trying to save your life and not get shot by this person. But when police look at it, it's also a statistical thing. Is this a robbery or an auto theft? I think it's an auto theft in terms of the statistics. We can also think about in this app how we use accurate definitions for things. And sometimes people come home and let's say they've been on vacation and they come home and they find a broken window and they come inside their house and it's obviously been burglarized, and they say, and I'm quoting here, "We've been robbed." And the answer is not actually true. You've been burglarized. And so it's an important distinction. Robbery means somebody used a weapon or force or fear to make you turn over your stuff. A burglary means somebody came into your dwelling, your car, your truck, your house, your barn, your outbuilding, and took stuff, and from a theft perspective. So the distinctions are pretty clear in the penal code, and so we talk about using the correct language when we report stuff to the cops. The same thing from the concept of assaults and batteries. You may have heard that phrase. He committed assault. Well, that's an attempt at battery. Battery is actually somebody putting physical hands on you, grabbing you, touching you, kicking you, punching you. Those are batteries. Assault is attempting to do that. So someone says, I got assaulted. I'm like, okay, did the person make physical contact with you? If he swung and missed at you, that's an assault. If he actually hit your face with his fist, that's a battery. Again, important distinction. If you're being punched, the answer is no. But it's useful to use the right kind of language when we think about the criminal justice system to be able to get the best use of that system for us. Let's say you're a business owner, and one of the things we'll have in the app is about shoplifting. And when can you make a, quote, citizen's arrest for shoplifting? And the concept of shoplifting or a citizen's arrest is there's a procedure you have to go through. And so when you witness a crime that the police did not witness, it's a misdemeanor, not committed in their presence. You have to be the one that makes the citizen's arrest. So if you're a store owner and you see somebody put, 3 pounds of steak in their backpack and try to leave your store, if you have a little grocery store or butcher shop, and you can detain them legally until the police get there. There's a lot of other issues about civil liability and putting hands on people and fighting and things like that, which we'll put in the app as well. But the concept of shoplifting itself says that you have the right to make a citizen's arrest. And so if the police get there and you're not willing to sign the form that says I'm making a citizen's arrest, the cops are going to let the guy go. Now, maybe you get your 3 pounds of steak back, and what does it go for? About $9.99 a pound. You get your steak back, but there are no consequences for this person's behavior. So the citizen's arrest process is really important because it says this is how we enforce consequences on people that do stuff that the police did not wish, that the police did not witness. Now, if they've seen it, it's they can make the arrest themselves. And if they did not see it, but it was a felony in terms of a serious crime, then they can make the arrest themselves based on probable cause. We'll talk about the sort of escalation that police need to go through when it comes to how they stop people and do their jobs in terms of making an arrest. It goes from a consensual or casual conversation into what's called reasonable suspicion, which means the person is not free to leave, and probable cause to make an arrest. So that moves up in the scale quite dramatically or quite quickly or quite slowly, depending on how the officer investigates things. So we'll talk about what your rights are. We'll break down in the app the Miranda warning. Everybody knows the Miranda warning, right? You have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided you prior to questioning. The Miranda warning has been around. Miranda Escobedo is the case since, I think, 1963 or 1964. We'll talk about in the app what the warning means and also what the two questions are asked. The first question of the Miranda warning is, do you understand your rights, yes or no? And the second is, if you understand your rights, are you willing to speak to me? And that's a yes or no question as well. And so sometimes crooks will do what's called waiving, which means they'll say, I'm not going to talk to you, and yes, I understand my rights. So we'll put the Miranda warning in there. We'll describe what it's all about. Somebody has said to me a long time ago, why don't we put the Miranda warning on the driver's license of everybody in the United States on the back of it, written in whatever language you want. So whether it's Tagalog or Vietnamese or Russian or Spanish or English, you can have the Miranda warning on the back of your driver's license so you know what your rights are. No one ever thought about that, but I think it's a good idea. We'll talk about how to be a good witness. We'll talk about problems that happen inside bars and places where there's alcohol. We'll talk about ways to prevent your car from being stolen. And still today, one of the primary reasons people get their car stolen is they leave the keys in the ignition. They leave the car unlocked. And it's still amazing to me in this date and time with all the advances we have about auto theft protection and things like that people still get their cars stolen by leaving the keys in the ignition. The other part about auto theft is that think of all the stuff that you have in your car that you don't want to get stolen. Handguns, purse, backpack, wallet, cell phones, laptops, your kids, your pets. I mean, there's a lot of things in your car that, when you get out to go drop off something at the mailbox and you leave the keys in the ignition. The other thing that sort of parallels that to me is how people are still, especially in my state in Missouri, being killed in car accidents where they don't wear their seatbelt. I didn't think it was possible to drive in a car these days in the year of 2020 without being bombarded with all kinds of signs and signals and warnings and alarms about not putting on your seatbelt. Lots of people seem to die in fatal accidents without having their seatbelt. So we'll talk about driving safety, and we'll talk about road rage, what things people can do to prevent road rage. You get a parking citation. We'll talk about how you fight a parking citation or how you fight a traffic citation. There are two types of citations you can get from the cops. One is a moving violation, which is typically called a hazard citation, and the other one is a fix-it ticket. In many states, getting a fix-it ticket, tail light, brake light, license plate light, no gas cap. There's a million ways that you can get a fix-it ticket. Is also accompanied by having to pay a fee in order to turn in the ticket and get the thing taken off your record. We'll talk about how to fight a speeding ticket, how to fight a traffic citation that you get, how to deal with a fix-it ticket. We'll talk about reporting child abuse. Reporting child abuse, we have something called mandated reporters, and that's cops and firefighters and medical people and clinicians and social workers. Librarians are mandated reporters. People that work in parks and rec situations are mandated reporters. So we'll talk about what it is to be a mandated reporter in child abuse. I was just looking at an article from a law firm today that says now human resources professionals are now mandated reporters for child sexual abuse, which is a very specific sort of a thing, and I'm not sure why we have that, but it's now part of, at least in California, part of a mandate for reporting. So we'll talk about how we report child abuse, who you report to in the county social services system, which is typically child protective services, a child and family services type of a hotline, which many of these are operated 24/7 by cities and counties, typically counties. We'll talk about reporting elder abuse, which is abuse of financial or legal or physical abuse or abandonment or neglect of somebody over the age of 60 or 65 and anybody who is a dependent adult. We'll talk about the laws in the app for driving while armed, what it means to drive in your car with a handgun, and where you should be carrying a handgun if you're outside your usual state and you don't have a concealed carry license for the whole country. We'll talk about that. We'll talk in the app about whether or not you should help the police if they're involved with wrestling with some suspect on the side of the road. This can be a really dangerous situation for the officers for sure, and it can be dangerous for you, and the cops don't always know whether you're a good guy or bad guy trying to help them. We'll talk about the protocol for how you step in a situation where you see a cop wrestling on the ground with some maniac who's trying to take his gun or her gun or assault this officer in some way. We'll talk about preventing burglaries. If you have a commercial business, how we prevent burglaries in a commercial business is different than home. And it's not just about alarm systems and not just about lights and cameras. There's lots of kind of a mindset that's different between home burglary prevention versus commercial business prevention. We'll talk about police practices in terms of how you make a citizen's complaint against them. There's a whole process for how you complain against officers, which a lot of people don't seem to know. They wait until the situation escalates and then it shows up on TV on their phone or something like that. That's how they make a complaint. But there's a whole citizen's complaint process for the internal affairs where cops are put on notice about their behavior, whether it's rudeness or sarcasm or racial or harassing type of behavior or use of force. So we'll talk about the citizen complaints process and how the internal affairs process works. We'll also talk about citizens review boards and what they mean in communities and why they're effective and why sometimes they're not effective. We'll talk about landlord-tenant disputes. Sometimes cops get called to situations, again, which are civil issues but not necessarily criminal, and so a landlord-tenant or they sometimes stand by for things called preserve the peace. You're getting a divorce, and sorry about that, but you got to get your tools, your equipment, your stuff out of your house. You got to get your clothing out of your house, your stuff that's, your computers, laptops, whatever. Sometimes the cops will stand by while you do that. They'll preserve the peace to make sure nobody gets injured while you're taking your stuff out during a divorce or a custody type of a situation. We'll talk about child custody in the app and what that means to when the cops stand by during child custody exchanges and things like that. We'll define disturbing the peace, and disturbing the peace is kind of a broad brush in many penal codes around the country about, what time of night your peace can be disturbed and what it means and all these things related to parties and loud engines and all kinds of stuff which disturb your peace in the neighborhood. So that's part of our kind of discussion about the quality of life as well inside the app. We'll talk about what it means to get arrested for drunk driving, which is an interesting thing these days. Lots of people get arrested for drunk driving and fear the worst in terms of losing their license. That's possible. Some states have pretty strict guidelines about first arrest, second arrest, and third arrest. We'll talk about that. We'll put in the app how to do the field sobriety test, how to do the thing that the police typically do when they pull you over on the side of the road. Now here's a little safety tip for you. Don't drink and drive, because even if you do really well on the field sobriety test, you're still going to get arrested if you have alcohol in your breath and you have something called horizontal gaze nystagmus. Horizontal gaze nystagmus is where you move the cops ask you to follow their finger, and at the 45-degree mark, if your eyeball jiggles like this, that means you have horizontal gaze nystagmus. You're at least 0.08 or higher. So the faster it comes on, the more drunk you are. So without moving, and you can do this with your friends at parties, 18 inches away, slightly elevated. Follow my finger over at the 45-degree mark over here. If I had 0.8 or higher in alcohol, my eyeball will jiggle. The faster it happens, the more drunk you are. So we'll talk about that. Getting arrested for drunk driving and what the steps are. We'll talk about getting arrested in general, what cops typically do. Maybe you've seen it on TV or the movies and how it really works in terms of going to jail and what the jail experience is like if you're in there for something like drunk driving or being drunk in public or something that people get arrested for sometimes. We'll talk about getting arrested for a federal crime, how that's different than a state penal code and what the consequences are and the penalties are. So federal crimes are typically handled by the FBI or state agents that are working as deputized, like for U.S. Marshals or something like that. We'll talk about the difference in the app between the police and the sheriff. The sheriff typically operates the jail in the county, and they are the county authority, and they have authority to make arrests in the city and county, whereas the police have authority to make arrests typically in the city. They typically serve the sheriff if they have to go into the county. We'll talk about state police. We'll talk about the difference between a state trooper and a state police officer. So lots of roles and duties and assignments for different law enforcement agencies. We'll talk about two things which are very popular in law enforcement now called community-oriented policing versus problem-oriented policing. And think about this as sort of the larger picture versus the smaller picture. Problem-oriented policing is a specific issue. Community-oriented policing is the larger issue in that same connection. So, for example, let's say you have a party house, frat boys, sorority sisters, a biker house, something like that, that's just loud parties all the time. That's a problem-oriented policing issue on your street. But the community-oriented policing part, the larger picture is parties in general. The problem-oriented policing part is that particular house. So the cops may go into your neighborhood and say, here's how we handle party houses, and specifically, problem-oriented policing is we're going to go after that one house that causes all the problems in the neighborhood. So the reason community-oriented policing exists, let's say it's speeding in the neighborhood around the school districts, right? Or you have school campuses, K through 12 schools where there's people speeding around there at all hours when kids are getting dropped off. That's a community-oriented policing issue. Problem-oriented policing, the solution would be to put cops with radar guns in front of the school on Monday morning through Friday morning between 7 and 8:30. So that is a solution for the community-oriented problem. We'll talk about what it means to go on a police ride-along and how you do that and how you can ride with the police or the sheriff in your community and go on a ride-along. And I always tell people that if you're interested in law enforcement as a career, going on a ride-along is a really terrific idea because you get the real rubber meets the road orientation of how cops do their jobs. And if you have a good officer that you ride with, not somebody who's just, hates the fact that they have a ride-along, but actually enjoys it and realizes it's kind of a recruiting tool for getting good people into law enforcement, then going on a ride-along is fun. I went on, I think, 3 of them before I joined the PD in San Diego, and they were all great. They're all very exciting, and it just reinforced my idea of wanting to be a cop. We'll talk about stalking as a behavioral issue in our communities, and stalking is connected oftentimes to domestic violence. Sometimes it is connected to people that you had an intimate relationship. Sometimes it's connected to strangers who become obsessed with you. We'll talk about stalking. We'll talk about domestic violence as a crime and also a workplace issue. We'll talk about workplace violence, active shooters, mass attacks. That's all part of the discussion there as well. We'll talk about what it means to be mentally ill in our society, what the police typically do. There's a 3-type criteria for how the cops make arrest for people that are mentally ill. Is this person a danger to themselves? They're suicidal. Are they a danger to other people? They're violent or homicidal. Or are they what's called gravely disabled? And in all 50 states, we have different versions of what gravely disabled is. So we'll talk about what happens to people. Maybe it's a family member of yours who goes to a mental health facility based on the police response where they take them in for an evaluation. We'll talk about vandalism and gang graffiti and what it means to be a gang member and how people get into gangs and what that whole sort of criteria is all about. So we'll provide a little primer on gang life in our app as well. We'll talk about police slang. I wrote a whole article. You can see it on Psychology Today. Go back about 5 or 6 years. If you put in Steve Albrecht and police slang, you'll find a piece that I wrote about police slang in Psychology Today, which is kind of fun. We'll talk about 10 codes and 11 codes and why cops and sheriffs use 10 codes and 11 codes. In my community in San Diego, a prisoner was called a 1016, and the reason we said this guy is a 1016 instead of saying I'm about to put my handcuffs on him right now to my partner means we want to get the guy caught off guard before a big fight starts. So we'll talk about why cops use 10 and 11 codes. We'll talk about homeless people in our communities and what we can do to support them or to serve them and to help them, what we can do if we have criminal behavior involving homeless people. Is it a police issue sometimes, or are there other social services that we may want to bring in? In the app, we'll talk about what's called the criminal justice triangle, which is cops and courts and corrections. And the criminal justice triangle obviously works together in those three areas in certain sort of distinctions. What do the police do? What do the courts do? And what do corrections do? So we'll have lots of sort of discussions about how you can get a sense of how the police function works in your community, in your state, in our country. We'll talk about what your rights are if you get stopped for what's called an FI. An FI is a field interview, and that's a slip that the cops fill out typically to say, why are you in this neighborhood at this time in the hour doing what it is that you're doing? And typically cops use FI slips, or what they call shake slips, as a way to identify people for detectives later on, or to verify where somebody is, or to verify who they're hanging out with, gang members, other crooks, things like that. An FI slip is not a permanent tattoo on your body, but it goes into a system, and people who are constantly being stopped by the police all the time know what it's like to be FI'd all the time, and they have the sense that this is how police sort of harass them. And it's not about that. It's like, why are you out at 2 o'clock in the morning in this alley? That's a perfect time for an FI slip or a field interview. We'll talk about how detectives work in most police agencies, how detectives get their cases, how detective sergeants do something called cut paper, which is they decide who gets certain types of reports and what it means to follow this process all the way through, so you can figure out as a crime victim what's your best sense of getting justice or getting your property back or whatever it happens to be. We'll talk about in our app, the cop in your pocket, we'll talk about your constitutional rights. You have a Fourth Amendment right to search and seizure protection, which goes away if you are a parolee. It goes away if you're what's called a fourth waiver. So if you get out of prison and you are getting out of prison early, you sign off your Fourth Amendment rights. You can be stopped and searched by cops 24/7 for any reason. It's part of your parole basis. We'll talk about bail and what it means to bail out of jail and how that works as part of the Eighth Amendment. We'll talk about your constitutional rights in the Bill of Rights, as opposed to how police can question and interrogate you and things like that, like you've heard about on TV or the movies. The Fifth Amendment, right? My right not to incriminate myself. We'll talk about a process the cops use called stop and frisk, and this is certainly really big in New York and other places where cops have whole squads of folks that went out and just looked for guns and drugs and what it means to be stopped by the police, and can you be frisked by the cops without your permission? And the answer typically is only for the cops to be able to search you, only to look for weapons that may harm them. They can search for what are called hard objects, things that could be obvious weapons to be used against them. They can search you for that in the street even without your permission. So we'll talk about this sense of what it means to be a crime victim is really kind of weird compared to how the state sees you. So, when O.J. Simpson gets arrested for a murder, allegedly, it's the state of California versus O.J. Simpson. The state becomes the victim in a lot of these cases. It's not you as Mr. Jones who got his car stolen by this crook Johnny over here. It's the state of whatever versus whoever Johnny is. So there's a weird sort of dynamic there in terms of how the state sort of steps in and takes over the role of victimhood for you, even though you're the one that got sexually assaulted or beaten or robbed or had your stuff stolen. It's kind of interesting how we do that. We'll talk about the differences between probation and parole. Probation is typically what you get when you come out of a county jail system, and parole is what you get when you come out of a federal jail or a prison or a state prison. And there's a big difference between those two. Probation officers have different work than parole officers. We'll talk about what it means to be a registered sex offender. All 50 states have it. It's called the Megan's Law. You can look up people on the sex offender database and what it means to be a sex offender. These are typically registration processes that have to happen once a year, 5 to 10 days before or after your birthday. You go down to a police agency or a sheriff's agency and you register with them your address and telephone number, etc. I did that process for about 2 years with the PD in San Diego. I registered those guys, and it was not a lot of fun. Basically, we look at what those people have done, and we compare their story that they tell us when they register with what we know about them to look for any changes in their story. And we think in the back of our minds, as good sex crimes detectives, is this person connected to something which may be an open case right now that we have based on their MO or the way that they do things. So we'll talk about the sex crime registration process and what it means. We'll talk about how people can be arrested for drugs, and typically, street drugs, marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, ecstasy, things like that. We'll talk about what drug arrests look like. We'll talk about the felony murder rule. The felony murder rule says that if you're in a car and somebody driving in the car shoots out the window and kills somebody, you could be charged for murder as well. We'll talk about the difference between murder and manslaughter. You may see that on TV or in the movies. We'll talk about that. The app will have a long discussion about how to get a CCW permit in your particular state if you need one. We'll talk about self-defense, firearm self-defense, and then what are called stand your ground laws and rules. The app will have some discussion about guns and owning guns. And we'll also talk a little bit about not only the discussion we had about citizens arrest, but also what private security guards can do. And private security guards, when can they have a gun permit? When can they have an exposed gun permit or a concealed gun permit? When can private security guards make an arrest? That type of thing. So that'll be part of our app as well. Arson as a crime will be described and discussed in our app, and what it means to be an arsonist and how those folks kind of typically work. There's a lot of cool books, including a really good one written by Joseph Wambaugh on arson. I forget the name of the book, but he wrote it several years ago about a Glendale fire investigator in Glendale, California, who was actually an arsonist. So a really cool book written by Joseph Wambaugh. Our app will discuss what we do about bomb threats, and whether you get a bomb threat at work or at school, what's our response. We'll talk about child pornography, child sexual abuse. We'll talk about fraud, especially fraud cases involving scams and things like that, embezzlement and ID theft. That'll be part of our app as well. Speaking of embezzlement, we'll talk about street cons and street con games. Those things still exist. You see, people playing three-card monte, or they're doing various things called the Jamaican switch and things like that. We'll talk about how some folks that are doing cons in people's home repair things or auto repair things, they come up to your house to do this. We'll talk about who investigates crimes that happen on Indian lands and Indian territory. That's typically the FBI. What do the U.S. Marshals do? They protect federal judges. They protect federal courthouses. They are the oldest law enforcement agency that we have in existence. Maybe the Postal Inspector is a little bit earlier than them, but they're one of the oldest as the U.S. Marshals. We'll talk about what the FBI does. What is their role and function. We'll talk about in our app who investigates crimes in the military. The Army has a Criminal Investigations Division, and the Air Force has Office of Security Services, and the Marine Corps has the NCIS like you see on TV. We'll talk about white-collar crimes. We'll talk about how we see things that are connected to frauds and embezzlement of a white-collar nature, maybe involving the Postal Service. We'll talk about Postal Service inspectors and what they can look at. You may not know this, but postal inspectors cannot search your mail without a warrant. So if you send something from your house to somebody else, they can't just pull it out of the mail and open it up and look at it. They need a warrant to do that. So we'll talk about what those guys are all about. How about the roles and duties of park rangers? The roles and duties of state park rangers versus federal park rangers. There's so many law enforcement agencies in D.C. that protect all kinds of interesting places. We have the Park Police that protect monuments. We have the Capitol Police that protect the Capitol building. We have Supreme Court Police that protect just the Supreme Court. So these all have law enforcement agencies in uniform and detectives for each of these places. So we'll have a long list in our app about what these various places do. We have EPA cops that protect the environment, and insurance fraud people and Medicare fraud folks that protect our national systems for that. So we'll also talk about what you can do to report certain crimes. You see a cop, or you have to decide whether you call a cop. You see a kid being abused at the mall by their parent or somebody. You see somebody dine and dash out of a restaurant. You see somebody shoplift. You see drug sales. You see prostitution. You see drunk driver on the highway. You see an aggressive road rage type of a driver. How do you report these things? And we'll have that in our app as well. These are the things that you tell the dispatcher. How do you get your property back if it's been impounded? How do you get your property back if your car's been impounded? We'll talk about CPR. How do you give CPR? And certainly these days the CPR rules have changed to now really focus on the compressions rather than just the breathing part. certainly during COVID and HIV and things like that. We'll talk about Good Samaritan laws in our country and what it means to give first aid or to help somebody. We'll talk about how you distinguish between private property activities versus public property activities, like towing a car away from a private parking lot versus towing a car away off the street. We'll talk about whether cops have ticket quotas. They do not. We'll talk about cops and donuts. They typically like those. We'll talk about how to be a safe driver, how to protect yourself if you get into a minor car accident versus a major car accident. There's something that I put in my new gun book, which is what happens to your firearm if you're a CCW holder and the fire department or the police or the ambulance folks come to take you to the hospital. What happens to your gun? Well, it typically gets locked in a box that's in the fire department's truck, or it's locked in a box that's in the ambulance, and it gets turned over to the hospital and locked in a box there. But that stuff needs to be worked out. If you have a concealed weapons permit, I would write on the back of my permit, here's what I want to happen to my gun, and make sure this family member gets it or something like that in the event that I'm incapacitated. How to be a safe driver, how to, again, avoid road rage, how to pull over safely when being stopped by the police. And we'll talk in our app, speaking of concealed weapons permits, what you do if you're carrying a concealed weapon and you are pulled over by the cops, what will you do? We'll talk about police pursuits and how they work and how they start them and stop them and how to get out of the way of a police pursuit. We'll talk about crimes in progress, what it means to see something that's happening that's a liquor store robbery or a bank robbery or something like that. What would you do? We'll talk about preventing workplace violence in your workplace and in your business and what the issues you may need to look at. That subject's all about revenge and how we treat people and people that are so angry at their employer or their bosses or coworkers that they want to kill them. We'll talk about that. Domestic violence in the workplace as well. How to keep your kids safe at school is part of our conversation. We'll talk about the role of safety and security at the airport and look at what the airport police do. We'll talk about how we store our guns safely in our homes, how we store our medications safely in our homes. We'll talk about juveniles and what they do in terms of the criminal justice system, how we have to have certain differences in how juveniles are arrested. Go back to the Miranda warning that I talked about as well. Do the cops have to read the Miranda warning to a 10-year-old that they arrested for stealing something? And the answer is yes. That's just what we do. We read the Miranda warning to everybody. But for juveniles, it's different how we handle them as opposed to adults who are arrested. So we'll talk about that as part of the app as well. So one of my functions in this app, Cop in Your Pocket, is to make it something that's entertaining, make it something that's informative, that gives you knowledge about certain things. And then if you ever thought to yourself, what would I do, or what should I do about, or if this situation arises, we're going to have so many choices under these various tabs that you'll be able to look at it and say, this is exactly what I need to do. Now, it'll vary state to state, but most of the information we have in this app is going to be very common, and it's going to be something that will be supportive to what you're trying to do for your safety, for your family, and just so that you have extra information. You can, go to a movie or watch a show on TV and say, is that what we really do? In law enforcement, the answer is probably not, that we do something different. So the app Cop in Your Pocket will be that thing that helps provide you information about what you're trying to do to keep yourself and your family safe and to give you more information as you go forward in life. So thanks for that. Now time for Crime Time's Stupidest Crook of the Week, one of my favorite parts of the show. Crime Time's Stupidest Crook of the Week, where we get to talk about some of our dumbest criminals who managed to get themselves arrested based on their monumental stupidity. Okay, Tennessee man ended up in the joint, no pun intended there, for smoking a joint while in court. Spencer Boston, age 20, and not a lot of people at age 20 have much brains about smoking pot in front of a judge, was in Wilson County, Tennessee, when he was charged with simple marijuana possession. Not to be deterred by the first drug, he began to argue in favor of legalizing pot. He pulled out a marijuana cigarette out of his pocket, lit it in court, and began puffing on it in front of Judge Haywood Berry. The man was able to get in several short inhales before the court security realized what he was doing and led him from the courtroom as laughter rose around in the crowd. Boston shouted as he was removed from the courtroom, "The people deserve better." He's quite the spokesman for the marijuana issue there. He was charged with disorderly conduct and, not surprisingly, another marijuana possession. He was held in contempt of court for his stunt. Wilson County Sheriff in Tennessee, Robert Ryan, said it's one of the craziest things I've ever seen. So you got to give the guy A for a kind of an interesting way to voice his opinion towards the legalization of marijuana in Tennessee. I'm not exactly sure what Tennessee's policy is on marijuana, but I'm not sure he helped his cause any. Okay, let's test your crime time IQ with this week's crime quiz question. What does ICAC stand for? ICAC. So this is kind of connected to our show last week when I interviewed Frederick Lane and his book on cybersecurity. We talked about cyber systems and cyber safety for your kids and your kids being exposed to pornography and people that are targeting children in their online world. ICAC stands for the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. So there are 61 ICAC task forces around the United States involving over 4,500 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers, agents, and also prosecutors. So an ICAC team, typically, if we look at all 61 around the country, may have a U.S. Marshal on it, an FBI agent, a customs agent from the federal level. It may have a postal inspector at the local level. It may have sheriffs and PD and detectives, child abuse detectives, child sexual assault investigators. It may have prosecutors from the federal level, prosecutors from the state and local level. And these people work specifically on internet crimes against children, typically involving child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, and child pornography. So we have something called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Cyber Tip Line, and that's at cybertipline.com or 800-843-5678. So NECMEC, or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, has been around for a long time, and they not only take care of and helping law enforcement agencies investigate child stealing, kids being abducted from healthcare situations like stolen infants, babies, and things like that, but also missing and exploited children that have been picked up as runaways or kidnapped in child sex slave operations or child custody issues where the non-custodial parent has taken the kid away. So NECMEC has a cyber tip line, again, cybertipline.com or 800-843-5678, and they work closely with ICAC agencies around the country. So ICAC's primary function, and this is a horrible job, somebody has to do it, but you can imagine how horrible it is. They look at child pornography all day long. One of my partners in the PD did this job, and it's just horrible. I mean, that's his function. He looks at child pornography all day, and they try to catch the people that are posting it, creating it, making it, exploiting these children, setting up these situations and stings and things like that where they can grab these guys that make this type of stuff and put it online. So ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children, these folks really prowl around what's called the dark web. So our crime time safety tip of the week is kind of going back to what Frederick Lane said last week, and I didn't get a chance to talk about it since we were kind of wrapping up early with him. I went long and talking with him, he's such an interesting guest and a lot of things to say, is really the importance of sitting down with your teenager or your pre-teenage kids and really talking about safe use of the internet. Now, they don't want to hear that stuff. They don't want to waste time talking with you about it. They don't want to share information with you about this stuff. But the earlier you can get this thing done with them, the earlier conversation you can have with them, the better it's going to be in terms of them understanding your need for their safety and also their need to report things to you that are outside the ordinary, where adults who are posing as teenagers are trying to lure them into meeting or lure them into kind of sending sexually explicit photographs, things like that. So it's really important to have those kind of boundary conversations with your kids that say, look, I'm not going to stand over your shoulder because I won't be able to for every single encounter you have online, but I'm really concerned about how you interact with people and who contacts you, and you need to tell me immediately if you feel uncomfortable about somebody who is doing something in our world that we call grooming, which is these adults that are posing as children, attempting to groom these kids into sexually explicit behavior, sexually explicit photographs. In the old days, we used to see these guys start off with asking a question in these chat groups called ASL. A for age, S for sex, and L for location. So ASL question mark meant how old are you, what is your gender, and what city are you in? And people used to answer accurately about this stuff, and then these predators would swoop in on these types of kids, male and female, in terms of trying to sexually exploit them. I think it's useful to download or look at on YouTube some of the old episodes of a TV show called Catch a Predator with Chris Hansen. Catch a Predator with Chris Hansen was one of those sort of groundbreaking shows where they did stings all the time to try to catch these guys that would connect first online with some girl who they thought was preteen or a boy who they thought was a teenager or a preteen, Turned out it was a sting set up by local law enforcement. They would get this predator to show up at the house, catch a predator, and the cameras would be there, and he would show up, and it would be some girl or some guy, typically a girl, and she'd say, "Well, I'll be out in just a second. Have some, iced tea," and he'd be sitting at the counter, and then Chris Hansen and the camera crew would swoop in with the cops and talk to this guy about his postings and his writings and the things that he had said to this girl online, of which the guy always denied. And then, of course, they would run out of the suspect would run out of the house and get tackled on the grass by the cops waiting outside. So quite an interesting show, Catch a Predator. So it's not on anymore, but you can download episodes on YouTube and kind of use that as sort of a reminder for your kids. So think about from the standpoint of that boundary you need to have with your kids, where you're not prying into every part of their life because they'll get secretive and they won't share things with you, but having an open dialogue and what Frederick Lane talked about last week in our show about having a fair use contract about how we allow your kids to do things online, where there's a behavioral contract between them and you as to what they can do and what they cannot do. So think about how these predators groom these kids. They start off by saying, don't tell anybody about our conversation. Don't share any of our text or posting with your parents or anybody else. We need to put in really solid guidelines and boundaries for our kids to say, look, that type of stuff is manipulative, and you have the right to come and share stuff with me, and I want to know what's going on in your life and when it comes to your online activity, so I can prevent you from being harmed. We see these cases happen all the time. Some 14 or 15-year-old girl goes off with some adult and meets up at a hotel, and something horrible happens. And I always look at the parents and go, where was the oversight? Where was the sense of, sometimes you have to be a parent, and sometimes you have to say, my kids don't have the right to do whatever they want until they're 18 years old in my house, and I still have the right to set rules and boundaries. So that's our Crime Time safety tip of the week. Download some episodes of Catch a Predator with Chris Hansen, watch that with your kids, and go, this is the stuff I do not want to happen to you, and look how easy it is for people to get in this situation, but they're manipulated or groomed by these predators. So thanks for listening to this episode of Crime Time. I encourage you to go to my website, crimetimeradio.com. Send me an email with questions and topics that you want me to cover in future shows. Connect with me on LinkedIn and on Twitter. LinkedIn is Dr. Steve Albrecht. That's ALBRECHT. And then Twitter is at Dr. Steve Albrecht. In our world, there are sheep and shepherds and wolves. Too many people are sheep and too few people are shepherds. Lots of wolves out there. There are not enough police officers or sheriff's deputies or federal agents to protect us all. You need to be a shepherd. Take care of yourself and protect your family, your loved ones, your friends, your coworkers. Pay attention. Be prepared to defend yourself with legal force if necessary. Be a good witness for the police if you see a crime. Stay safe and aware and alert at home, at work, at school, and even on the road. Thanks for listening to Crime Time. My thanks to Jim Whining and producer Matt and producer Jeff and all the good folks at Axe Media Group. I'm Steve Albrecht, and thanks for listening to What I Know is Right.